first time was possible. Scalable marketing in terms of reaching mass markets at a national level and ultimately global level was for the first time possible. It led to a very different set of institutions that captured the economic value of the 20th century. We're saying that in part because of a new infrastructure, a digital infrastructure that's emerging on a global scale, we're going to see a similar kind of restructuring at a global level. I'll just make one other point about Richard Florida, which is an interesting element in our thinking around this overall shift index. Was he also wrote an article a couple of years ago for The Atlantic, which was entitled "The World is Fighting." And it was meant to be an explicit challenge to another great perspective, which was the world is flat. And he posed a paradox, which we think is a very interesting one, and we all ought to engage on. As the world gets flatter and flatter in terms of digital connectivity, why is the movement into talent concentrations in cities actually increasing rather than diminishing? We can connect anywhere. Location, in the words of Tom Friedman, is irrelevant. Doesn't matter where you are, you can connect. But why are all these people moving into cities at the same time? And why is business travel actually increasing at the same time that we have all this digital infrastructure, which is another one of the metrics we looked at. We think a lot of it has to do with the notion of enhancing face-to-face knowledge flows that are absolutely essential to accessing the kind of tacit knowledge that JFC was talking about.
But notice the irony. The world can both get flatter and spikier.
Yes. Yes, they're both going on.
And the irony is, now the catch is, how do you find the spikes in network? If you're doing a startup, it's the very first thing you do. Find where are the spikes? How do I connect them? What can I do? Well, I just want to say, I start liking flights. I'll be right there. You go to Bangalore, you go 10 miles outside.
Different world.
10 miles north, you do.
All right, we got a bunch of people who want to get it. Yeah.
Okay. Verna Alley with ValueNetworks.com. As you both know, we're in violent agreement about the need to start looking at flows of knowledge. My question, and you've in part answered my question already with the indicator on passion, but more specifically, how are people starting to look at knowledge flows as part of their business model instead of something that is in the background or outside of the business model, both at the level of the firm and more specifically in industry clusters or regions, which is where some of our own work is going in this direction as well.
You know, at one level, we're optimistic because we see these pressures that are going to force institutions more into these networks and knowledge flows. At another level, we're very pessimistic. I think when you look at most companies today, they do have networks or relationships with a lot of other companies. They tend to be extremely transactional in nature, very much zero-sum kinds of relationships where if you win, I'm going to lose, so I'm going to be the winner. And I think there's a need to move to a very different kind of structure of network and a relationship-based network, which frankly we see much more innovation in China and in India than we do here in the U.S. or in Western Europe. So we would highlight that actually when we go global, we expect to see some increasing pressure on the U.S. because other countries are actually demonstrating more awareness.
But notice how some of our larger companies even are experiencing open innovation, or better yet, open source, as opposed to open innovation. Open source networks tend to have more of a relational structure.
I had the same question as Shannon earlier about assets and asset classes. It seems to me that, 40 years ago, a company that would own a building might now have really short-term leases. But I also get your point about how we should be getting more return on that than less. But I'm curious why you wouldn't look at return on labor, because the cost of labor, from my perspective, is much more now than it was 40 years ago, and, looking at productivity is interesting, but it's not the apples-to-apples comparison, and it seems to me if you're getting a higher or lower return on labor, that's more indicative, that would be apples-to-apples if you said, well, companies had more money invested in assets 40 years ago, and now we're less manufacturing and more IT, focused, even if you're not an IT company, right, you invest in a lot of software now. and you depreciate that over 3 years. And so if you look at the labor, it would seem to me to figure out whether or not you're getting a return on your investment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an interesting metric. To some degree, labor productivity captures a bit of that. It's looking at total revenue per employee, so you're getting some proxy for return on labor. At the end of the day, we still have assets. It's not just labor, we have assets. And the notion of return on assets captures return on labor because we're paying salaries, and that's reflected in the income statement. But we also have assets that have to get covered. So our sense was that we really need to look at the overall investment of the business, not just in the employees, but in all of the assets, whether they're fixed assets or current assets. But it is an interesting question. And the other question, too, is what's accessible in terms of all public companies from an external view. I mean, if we could go into companies and rip apart their financial performance, we could do some much more subtle or sophisticated kinds of measures. It would be much harder for all public companies over 1965.
All right, got a lot of hands here. Go ahead.
I'm Rita Jenkins. I'm the executive fellow with the Social Capital Group, formerly with UPS Orbit Strategies. And I don't mean to bring it back around to Rich Florida, but part of his work, he was quoting work that was done at the Santa Fe Institute on metabolic rate. And part of that work talked about the Great Reset. And there was an interesting part of that work that said that cities get to this point, as well as companies, of stall point, but that some cities were able to grow and outstrip that metabolic rate. And it had to do with the density of what he called an underlying ladder. And are you thinking that the work that you're doing is very much like that in terms of what you described as digital infrastructure? And how do you look at density in the work that you're
doing? It's a great question. We are obviously very heavily influenced by Richard Florida's work. One of the metrics that we looked at is population movement into what he calls creative cities in the United States. Population